Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, both those who were here yesterday and those who are joining us for the first time today. Apologies to anyone who was here yesterday, as there is going to be a little bit of repetition during the introduction. This is the second session in our first Common Home, Common Ground webinar mini-series. The four-part Is the Media Failing Us on Climate Change? I'm Georgina. I work at Hope for the Future as the Media Outreach Officer. And I'll be hosting the webinar today, and I've been joined by Emma, our events officer, and Georgia, our communications officer. As you know, today we'll be discussing the challenges of communicating the climate crisis in the media. Hope for the Future is a climate charity which works to equip communities, groups, and individuals across the country to communicate the urgency of climate change with their local politicians, so we can support you to engage with your local representatives on the issue of climate change. This webinar is part of Hope for the Future's Press Here for Change project, which works to connect decision makers with local media to report on the challenges and opportunities presented by the climate crisis in a way that is relevant to people's lives. We feel it is vitally important for communities around the UK that MPs and constituents have rich and challenging conversations about the climate crisis. Local grassroots democratic engagement is essential if we're hoping to transition to a greener society equitably. Local media can be a powerful tool to drive this community engagement, and throughout this week, we'll explore these issues in greater detail. The purpose of these webinars is to create a space where people can come together to have climate conversations from home, reflecting on how we can ensure that local democracy is built on green principles. We're exploring all of Hope for the Future's project areas throughout this week. So we've got media throughout this webinar series. So we've got media this week, and then MP engagement, young families, youth, and faith. You can register for free for any of these webinars on Eventbrite, and we'll be sending you the link at a later stage. We'd like to thank the European Climate Foundation and Gower Street for funding both our events project and our media project, which has allowed us to put on these webinars. So just before we get started, I've got to go over some housekeeping. Firstly, we'll be recording the webinar, so it'll be available on demand for you to rewatch and share. We'll send attendees a follow-up email directing you to Hope for the Future's latest resources, to our Eventbrite page, and anything else that might be relevant. We'll do that on Thursday after the last session. For timings, we're going to have about 30 to 40 minutes for our speakers and then 20 minutes for questions, so we should be wrapped up around 3-ish. We want to hear all of your questions, so please post them in the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and we'll get to them in the last 20 minutes. Emma's going to be monitoring questions. Given that we've got two panelists today, it'd be great if you could let us know who you're directing your question to. You also have the power to upvote questions. So if someone else asks a question that you think is good, just click on the thumbs up icon and it'll flag it for us, so we're more likely to see it. You can get involved by following us on social media and hashtagging HFTF webinar or Common Home. You should also be able to see a chat box where you can speak to the other webinar attendees during the session, but please don't put your questions in there. Please put the questions in the Q&A. And at the webinar, a feedback form is going to be popping up. It would be great if you could spend a couple of minutes filling that in. We'd really appreciate it. As I said previously, I've been joined by Emma, so she's going to be monitoring your questions, as well as Georgia, who's monitoring the chat box. So if you have any tech issues or kind of practical questions, please put them in the chat box and she'll be able to reply. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for today, who'll be covering the topic of the challenges of communicating the climate crisis in the media. Firstly, Emily Beament. Emily has been the environment correspondent at PA Media for more than 12 years. Her beat ranges from climate change and energy to wildlife and farming, from ash dieback to household waste and recycling and the reintroduction of beavers. She has led coverage on the environment as it has risen up the agenda. She also covered UN climate conferences and international environmental science reports, and will be leading PA's coverage in the build-up to COP26 being hosted in the UK in 2021. Also, Arwa Aburawa, she's a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker interested in social and environmental issues. She's covered issues such as the water crisis in Iran, the life of sugarcane workers in El Salvador, and the farming communities in Burkina Faso. Previously a producer for Al Jazeera's English Al Jazeera English environmental medical shows, her work has been published in The Guardian and The Huffington Post, amongst others. She is also an International Women's Media Foundation Fellow and One World Media Fellow. So I'm going to pass over to Emily, who's going to start us off today. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. So I'm the environment correspondent for PA Media, the Press Association. And for those of you that don't know what PA is, we are the UK's national news agency. And we put out stories to all of the regional, national, local newspapers, radio, TV, and online news sources. And I've been doing this job for, as you heard, over 12 years, nearly 13 years. And in that time, I've seen some very significant changes in the way that that the media covers climate change. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of those changes I've seen and then go on to talk about some of the challenges that I face in reporting on climate change. So over the last decade, around the time I took over in 2007, climate change was reasonably high on the agenda, and it rose up over the next couple of years until the point at which we hit the global economic crisis, when suddenly there was a feeling that, oh, we can't be worried about climate change, we've got to deal with this economic crisis. And in the midst of that, we had the 2009 arguably failed climate talks in Copenhagen. And off the back of that, there was a real slide down the agenda for climate issues. And that's not to say that there wasn't things happening and that I was busy in all that time still. There were lots of stories going on about wind power and renewables and the decline in coal and how we make our homes more energy efficient. But it wasn't getting the reach, it wasn't getting the headlines that perhaps it had been a few years earlier. And then it began to rise up the agenda again, and we saw that sort of with the Paris climate talks. It suddenly exploded back onto the agenda. We got the Paris Agreement, and then there wasn't a decline after that. It's continued to increase, I think, up the agenda, and I think there's three reasons for that. First of all, increasingly we're seeing the impacts of climate change. We are seeing these heat records being broken, we're seeing heat waves, we're seeing floods in the UK, the Australian bushfires, and people are increasingly making that connection between those impacts they're seeing in their actual lives and what they've previously read or what the science is sort of saying. And we've had some really big major science reports in the last couple of years as well, which have helped keep the profile up. So we've had the IPCC's report on 1.5 degrees Celsius and keeping temperatures to that level and what that's going to take and what it would mean. And we've also, really importantly, had some very significant reports on nature and the nature crisis, and beginning to make that connection between climate and nature and these twin crises that are going to have to be solved together. And then the third thing, of course, obviously, is the grassroots campaigns that have come up and really pushed climate up the agenda in the last couple of years. So obviously Greta Thunberg and the school strikers around the world, and Extinction Rebellion being the two main ones. And I think what's interesting is if you look kind of across the decade at what the media have been doing, obviously the likes of The Guardian and the New York Times, who are media organisations you would expect to be covering this, have been. You've also seen the BBC setting out its stall on much wider coverage and much more intensive coverage of climate change, although obviously with the pandemic that's sort of been derailed a bit. But you've also seen some really interesting moves by some of the media you wouldn't have previously expected to see covering this. So we've had front page splashes in the Mirror on climate change, and the one I always think of as the sort of moment where I felt things were really changing was about 2 years ago. The Sun had a front page splash of "The world's on fire," and the story only had one quote, and it was from a climate scientist saying this is because of climate change, this is what we're seeing with these heat waves and these fires. So it has changed, and I think there's a lot more space in the media for talking about climate change, but there are still some major challenges for covering climate change, and one of them is quite a practical one, and the others I think are more philosophical ones. So I'm going to deal with the practical one first. And if any of you follow me on Twitter, you will have seen a thread on this, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But there is a lot of jargon in climate reporting. It's true in lots of subjects, but I think that the combination of having a lot of science input into this subject, but also increasingly talking in sort of political terms and sort of societal terms, we end up as a sector talking a lot in terms of circular economy and just transition, and these are terms that either people don't understand or they mean different things to different people. So I think one of the big challenges is clarity and making sure that everyone understands what it is you're talking about, because I can tell the best story in the world, but if I tell it in Spanish and you don't speak Spanish, you're not going to care or be engaged. So that's a daily challenge for me, is getting, is working my way around the jargon and trying to explain and engage through the language I use. The second one, which I touched on briefly when I mentioned the pandemic, is how do you make space for what is a sort of very slow moving juggernaut of news in the context of all of the other stuff that's happening on a day-to-day basis. So, we may have a shooting or, a massive political announcement today, but carbon emissions, carbon atmospheric levels are the highest they've been for 2 million years today, but they were yesterday, and they will be tomorrow, and they will be the day after that. So how do you find space to tell that sort of much slower moving story? And there have been some really good ways, and I think it's one of the things that the climate strikers and the XR protests have done, is that they have made it newsy to then be able to go and talk about these sort of broader issues. And I think it's the same with things like floods. And there's obviously a tonal issue there with, you can't see a flood and go, well, we told you so. But there is then space created by an event like that to begin to have those sort of broader conversations. And then the sort of third big challenge I find is finding a balance. And I don't mean so much the sort of balance between different opinions, although that was a big issue when it was talking about science and talking about false balance and this attitude that if you had a climate scientist here, you then had to have a climate skeptic there. And I think that's gone. I think we've moved on from that. But we are also having to obviously have different political points of view as we sort of try and find our way through things like how we cut emissions from various sectors. But I think a more fundamental balance that needs to be struck is a balance, if you like, between sort of the cold, hard truth of how scary this issue is, and we still have to go on reporting the science. The basic science is settled, but there are lots of new angles to the science that are still being done, and we do need to talk about that, and we do need to write stories that are often really scary. But I think there's a real, if we want to carry on engaging people and we don't want to make people just feel sort of hopeless and helpless, then we have to find ways of telling positive stories as well, stories of the potential for solutions, and find a way to keep people engaged and keep people wanting to know more and to do more. And I think one of the ways we do that is by telling different kinds of stories. And I think that would probably be a good moment for me to hand over to Arwa, because I think she's going to talk in more detail about the kinds of stories that we can tell.
think I'll be building on a lot of the things that you've said. So thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation with everybody and just to kind of engage on some of the challenges that you guys are facing and what we can do about it. I just want to start by saying thank you so much to Hope for the Future for inviting me, and especially to Georgina for making the effort to kind of find me and include me in this conversation. I don't really do a lot of these talks very often, and partly I don't feel like I'm qualified on all these things, and so it was really nice for Georgina to kind of come along, invite me, and just encourage me to take part. Georgina actually also reached out to me through a project called Climate Reframe, which is a project that was launched by the Doc Society, and the main aim of it was to include more Black and minority ethnic voices in the conversation around climate change in the UK. And so it's a really important aspect of learning how to kind of communicate climate change and to look at the challenges, is actually to have more diversity in the people who are telling these stories, who are kind of approaching us about these issues. I think a lot of the times we are having these conversations told by the same kind of middle class, middle-aged white man. And I think that really is a big challenge for climate change, because it just tells a lot of communities that this isn't a story for you or about you or involving you, which is obviously not true. And so it's really important to challenge that and to have lots of different voices and perspectives and views, because the climate change includes so many important things such as animal conservation, but also like climate justice and inequality and lots of various kind of perspectives and views and issues. And so it's really important to have as many voices in that. And I think that's a big part of learning to communicate climate change better, is to include these voices. And there's lots of ways you can do it. So if you're writing an article, if you're hosting an event, or putting on, if you have a panel and it's like looking very, as one of my friends would say, pale, male and stale, then do try to reach out to other people and invite them. And you might have to coax them a little bit, like maybe like Georgina did to me, because we're not used to being approached, we're a bit nervous and stuff, but it's really worth doing it, and it's really worth having these people be part of the conversation. I mean, and the one thing you can do is reach out to Climate Reframe. They have a list of over 100 people on their website, of people who are from the Black and minority ethnic communities who are experts on these issues. So it's definitely a great place to start, is Climate Reframe. Aisha and the researcher Fatuma are fantastic at what they do, and they're really helpful at finding the right person for what you're looking for. So yeah, I want to start off with saying thank you, but also just acknowledging the importance of bringing more diverse voices into this conversation. It's really important. So yeah, I wanted to start off with that. And I kind of got a very meandering career in climate change reporting. I started off writing for newspapers and magazines. I actually used to co-edit this self-published activist publication with a friend in Manchester, and then I ended up working for a huge international broadcaster. And it kind of brings me to my first point about reporting climate change, second point, sorry, which is the media is so big and diverse, and it's got so many different ways of working. It has news, we have podcasts, we have documentaries, we have magazines, we have blogs. There's so many like different elements to it, and I think we really need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about reporting climate change, because like the news, like Emily was mentioning, are really good at reporting certain things. They're really good at reporting crises. Like when the bushfires happen in Australia, they're fantastic at that. They're really good at reporting crises because they have a like distinct beginning and a distinct end, and the news is very reactive. But as kind of Emily points out, they're not so good at reporting kind of more structural issues, slow moving kind of stories. And it's not just climate change. I think they're very bad at reporting sexism and racism and inequality, because they're kind of harder to kind of put your finger on. They're almost like intangible, and they're not stories that are kind of constantly breaking. So I think for me, when I think about reporting climate change, I'm constantly thinking about what's the story I'm trying to tell, and what's the medium that's best for telling this story. And sometimes that could be a podcast, because it's more able to explore complex issues. So I think for me, like one of the things that we always need to think about with climate change is, what's the story I'm trying to tell, and what's the medium that's best to tell it, because the media isn't like this monolithic thing. It's very diverse. And so in terms of like being able to better report it, we need to like know our story and know where it fits best. Like, is it best if I'm reporting on a kind of a big crisis like a fire, then yeah, breaking news is a great place to report it. But if I'm reporting on climate injustice and climate refugees, then maybe a documentary, something that can kind of explore these issues more in depth, is a better place to go. So yeah, I think that's like one of the things that I always kind of remind people, because I feel like sometimes media gets this really bad press that we're all the same and we all do the same thing, when it's not true. We're very different, and we can have hyper local news people who are very good at reporting on local issues, and we can have huge international broadcasters which can maybe tackle very different issues. So yeah, it's big and it's complicated and it's messy, but it's definitely not all the same thing. So that's an important aspect to think about. And yeah, and one of the things that Emily also mentioned, which is I think is really important, is when people like us who really think about climate change a lot, and it's something that we're really incredibly passionate about, sometimes forget that we're competing for a space in people's lives and in the media, because there is so many, like you're saying, there's like political scandals, there's economic crises, there's all these things, and you've had editors being like, we already covered climate change last week, we've already done a story on wetlands. And so we always have to kind of be really savvy about answering the question which editors always ask, which is like, why this story and why now? Like, we really need to kind of take ourselves out of a situation that we're in right now, and imagine we're somebody else who's really busy, a busy mom who's got loads of other things to think about. How am I going to connect to her? How am I going to make this story an important story for her? So yeah, I think that's one of the things we also need to think about, is we are competing and we are having to like sell our stories, and we really need to think about that. And there's lots of different ways that we can tell our stories better, but it's important to know that we are kind of fighting to tell our story. And one of the things that like I found while reporting on climate change issues is, one of the things that always really works is to like humanize the story. Like, people are not that interested in policy, they're not that interested in talking about just stats and numbers and, you know, climate change policies and like the science sometimes, but they're really passionate about hearing how it impacts people. So they really want to hear about how, you know, energy policies can impact energy policies have an impact on people's lives in terms of like fuel poverty and whether they can pay their bills. They really want to like connect to people and how these stories and the science and these stats and these policies actually impact people's lives, because that's something that people can connect to, and that makes the story like way more real. And so whenever I'm always thinking about like climate change, I'm always thinking about, okay, who's the person that's impacted for this? Where's like the human story that people can connect to? Because that makes our kind of job much easier in terms of bringing people into the conversation and making them aware of what's happening, and also just encouraging them to take action as well. Because I think that's the other thing that, that I wanted to kind of like look at and explore, is that a lot of the times our reporting, like Emily was saying, it kind of flits between despair and like complete fear, like, guys, this is terrible and everything is going really bad and we need to take drastic action, or else we're doomed to kind of like, oh, everything's kind of okay, and there's these small people that are taking these actions, and aren't they inspiring, and wow, that's incredible. And they're both deeply flawed in my mind. I don't think you can sell people a story of everything's solved or a story of everything's doomed. I think you have to find a space in between where it isn't hope and it isn't fear. And for me, I think that space in between is like advocacy and action. It's kind of saying, this is what's happening and these are our options. And there are things you can do, but we can't rely on a small group of people to take action. We can't rely on a small organization to do everything for us. We have to be part of that conversation. We need to take the action. And I think like an organization like Hope for the Future is really important, because it kind of connects those dots. It's saying, here's the information, now take action with it. Like, you know, put pressure on MPs, inform other people, like connect that kind of information into action. And I think that's really, really like important for people to do, because sometimes there's this kind of notion that what's missing in people's lives is that they just don't know enough about climate change. And I'm really skeptical about that. I feel like people are actually incredibly well informed about climate change, and it isn't a problem of information deficit. I think it's more of a problem of like action. It's more of a problem of people finding ways that works for them to do something. And I think that's a big part of it, because I think this conversation is obviously really important because we're exploring the role of the media and what we can do. But I'm also like very cautious in kind of saying that the media is the one who's going to solve all this. It doesn't fall to journalists to solve this economic and kind of political crisis and all the kind of different aspects of climate change. It's like a huge, huge issue, and like so many people need to be involved and so many people need to be able to take action. It isn't just on the media. Like, we are not the people that are in charge of fixing this. There's so many people that need to be involved, and our job is informing and encouraging action, but that's just one step, and there has to be so many other steps. And I'm not like belittling the media or like saying that they have a small role. I'm just saying they have one role amongst lots of other roles that need to be done and lots of other actions that need to be taken. So I'm always kind of careful when I hear people that are like, oh, it's kind of the media's fault, it's the media hasn't done a good enough job. I feel like, yeah, that's true to a certain extent, but it's on all of us to correct people. It's on all of us to educate people. It's on all of us to pressure our MPs and to push for better policies. It isn't just a matter of the media having enough headlines and putting it on front pages of newspapers all the time. It's a much broader issue, and it involves like journalists and people in the media and people outside of it. So yeah, I think that's really an important thing for me, is just like moving beyond the kind of hope and the fear, and just including as many people in this conversation and making sure that they know what they need to do. And I think it's been really interesting. So I work a lot more in documentary now, and I've seen like in the last couple of years that lots of documentary filmmakers are starting to think about the impact that their work has. So they're like, you know, you've watched an hour-long documentary on corals, here's what to do next. Like, you know, they're thinking about the impact that their work can have, and they're connecting those dots. You've watched, you know, an hour documentary on something else. This is how you can support the cause. This is how you can pressure for better policies. And so I think that thinking about that kind of impact and advocacy, for me as a kind of an activist and a journalist, I think that's really important. And I think that's one thing that we can do as journalists, is to kind of point people in the right direction in terms of like what to do next. So yeah, that's kind of like my take on the situation in terms of like the challenges that we face, and like also some of the opportunities that are kind of presented to us in terms of having a better conversation about these kind of issues and topics. I hope it was useful.
Thank you so much, Arwa. That was really, really interesting. And Emily, we can kind of move on to questions now, I think. Please, everyone, post any questions that you might have in the question box. I think Emma is currently monitoring them. I had some questions myself as well, just in the meantime. You've kind of both touched on the sort of intersection between media and activism. From like your own experience, is that something that people within the media are thinking about encouraging action on the issue? Because you kind of, in my head, I'm thinking of it as, you know, organizations that don't want to be seen as biased or kind of leaning readers in one direction or another. But is that something that journalists are thinking about, that they can get people to take action on something like climate change when they're writing or producing their work?
Should I start with that one? Because I think Ara and I are going to have very different takes on this particular one. Obviously, the Press Association (PA) is a news agency that supplies all the different outlets to news. So with news, so we don't have a political bias. I think any journalist who said that they are without bias is disingenuous, because every story you choose to write and every turn of phrase you choose to include is ingrained with, you know, some kind of level of bias. Just to choose to write about a story and the manner in which you choose to write about it, you know, it is sending a message of sorts. And so there is always that, but obviously from my point of view, I consider the step that I take when I was talking about those steps, I think probably the step that I take as an agency journalist is that first step of bearing witness. And often I am writing about, for example, a campaign, and in doing so I am signposting that the campaign is happening, and there is an implicit sort of possibility that you can read something, and by reading it you are inspired to do something. And then the next step is obviously, in this day and age, very simple to get on Google and Google the organization that I've mentioned or the story has mentioned. Or if you're a farmer and you're reading about like a rewilding farm scheme and you think, oh, that sounds great, you know, you then so I guess, I suppose, for me, the challenge is to inspire people enough to take that next step themselves, because I can't, in my position, really, you know, push them into that next step. But I think I was probably in a different position there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like, I came to kind of journalism with a kind of belief that there was climate change was this huge challenge that the world was facing and that we needed to do something about it. And so I think that like a big part of it for me is that I kind of came from an activist background, and I came to journalism from an activist background, and I didn't shy away from saying, hey, this is what's happening, this is kind of what we need to do. Because I think if you're seeing this crisis and you're understanding it, it's hard to kind of be like, but cool, live your lives, do whatever you want. I think it's really hard for me to just be like, here's the information, do with it what you want. I think I have a duty as a journalist also to put this in a context, in this information. I can't just give people the science and say, hey, here's what's happening. I think I have to contextualize it. That's kind of also my job as a journalist, is to put things into context and to kind of show the scale of the challenge and show the scale of what we're doing right now and how there's this huge gap. And also, yeah, I think through all my like reporting, I focused on climate change and environmental issues. And I worked for a show for a very long time, which kind of pushed the very kind of hopes kind of perspective. And I've worked with activists that sometimes push the fear perspective too much. But I kind of came to the conclusion that we needed the middle path, and it had to include being really honest about the need to take action, and not to come across as kind of preachy and stuff, but just to be like, this is the challenge that we're facing, and we have a moral duty to take action. We have a moral duty, as not as journalists, but as like citizens of this earth and as individuals and as humans living in this kind of society. We have a duty to each other. We have a duty to the societies that we impact, and therefore we have a duty to take action on climate change. And so, yeah, I guess for me, I've worn kind of that, kind of those beliefs on my sleeve kind of thing. But I came to kind of journalism very much from an environmental background, and I've always reported on climate change issues. And I kind of did that because for me, it was a way to encourage more people. So I think it's different. And I think journalism is so different, and two journalists are never the same. And I think that's kind of the beauty of the media, is you can kind of do with the media what you want. You can be an activist and start your own publication. You can be, you know, a filmmaker and talk about climate change issues and documenting the impacts that it's having right now. You can definitely just find different ways that kind of ring true to you to take action. There isn't like one way, there isn't one path. You just kind of have to find what works for you and what you feel comfortable with. That means that at the end of the day, you can look yourself in the mirror and be like, okay, I kind of have a clear conscience. So I would say it's probably, and Emily would agree, that it's incredibly varied, and journalists come at it from incredibly different perspectives, and none of them are right and none of them are wrong. But we can definitely not say that we can be objective and just neutral. It's insane to be neutral, I think, in a situation like this.
Well, there's no such thing.
Exactly.
I suppose media being so broad nowadays, right? It's not just like your Sunday newspaper, that you get activist publication, and then you get the more traditional press association type things where maybe you're kind of more have to be based in the science, but it is so broad, and it can be a really powerful tool as well to deal with these issues. Emma, have you been monitoring audience questions? Are there any ones I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, George. Yeah, I have been monitoring your questions, and we've had some questions submitted in advance from Eventbrite. Thank you both for your presentations. They were so good, so interesting. And so to kick off, I just wanted to pick up on a point that you both made about responsibility for communicating climate change in media, particularly around issues of jargon. So we've had a question from Rachel about you mentioned the jargon of, the jargon of climate change, so things like net zero, which the majority of people don't understand. What's the role of the media in increasing awareness and understanding around technical concepts? And are there any innovative ways the media has done this in the past?
I'll take that one, shall I? I think that I think there's several things that are important there. I think the first one is understanding in the first place that people don't necessarily understand, and not taking it for granted. I mean, I did a very unscientific poll of 3 of my best friends from school about whether they understood what the circular economy and the just transition or even the Paris Agreement were, and no, they don't. So that was a kind of wake-up call to me. And then that was followed very recently by a government public attitudes tracker survey, which showed that only a third of people thought they knew the faintest thing about what net zero was. So, Rachel was right in her question there. And I think there is a responsibility by journalists to always, and this is not just climate change, this is not just science, this is in all journalism. We have a responsibility. We are communicators, that's what we do. And if we're not communicating concepts effectively, then we're not doing our job. And one of the things that a lot of science journalists have a science background, and I actually think that often that's a hindrance rather than a help, because they understand it, but they don't remember that other people don't understand it. So I think, there's a huge responsibility to really boil down concepts into simplified form, but not so simple as to lose the nuance that I think Arwa was talking about in the sort of ways you explore things. So I spend a lot of time trying to, and again, I am a very short form journalist. I generally have about 500 words to tell most stories. So if you're spending 100 of those words explaining the Paris Agreement, that's a lot of your story. So, I do a lot of time trying to really sort of crystallize, and it's a good exercise actually, is to try and explain things in as tight a linguistic way as possible. But it is a challenge, and I think from a kind of wider sector perspective, the challenge is not to include lots of jargon in your quotes, or to, if you're putting together a press release, don't just lob in we need to be Paris compliant, and we need to have the just transition. And it's like, well, yeah, now I'm going to have to spend 3 paragraphs explaining your 1 paragraph of quotes. Or, and just when you're talking to anybody, if you're just down the pub, you can't just be like, oh, well, we need net zero. It's like, well, so it's definitely beholden on the media to do that, but it's beholden on all of us to be really kind of thinking about the way we communicate to other people, what our concerns are and what these issues are.
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with Emily that we do have responsibility, and I think a big part of why a lot of jargon does end up being included in lots of climate change kind of stories and stuff is that a lot of the times we talk to the same people, and we talk to other people who are really they know, we talk to an NGO who also knows all about these issues and will use the same jargon as us. And so we'll end up in this kind of miniature bubble where we all think we know what we're saying to each other, and we all think everyone understands us, but we don't. And so I think for me, again, I'm always trying to be as inclusive to as many people as possible. And yeah, and just to bring in different voices really helps sometimes, not to use the same experts all the time, not to use the kind of same scientists all the time, to kind of sometimes focus on what does this mean in terms of the impact. Because I think sometimes it's really important to explain kind of concepts and jargon and terminology, but it's also really important I think it's more important to kind of explain the impact of this. What is the purpose of this? What are they trying to achieve? What will happen? How will this play out? I think sometimes that's more complicated, but also just as important. And yeah, I would echo Emily's kind of point of it's definitely our responsibility, but there's lots of other people who have that kind of role as well. I think NGOs can play a really good role. I've seen lots of kind of different kind of people making the effort to kind of simplify things and to make things accessible to people. Because like you were saying, Emily, there's no point doing these amazing articles and things if it's in Spanish and no one can understand it. We're kind of losing our power as people who communicate if we're not reaching people, if we're not explaining ourselves, if we're not making our points clear. But yeah, there are different ways, and I think it's really interesting. I've seen in lots of different other fields that people are using, I did a documentary recently about a data journalist who used really simple sketches to kind of make data way less complicated, and she literally just hand drew stuff, and making something that was kind of simple and kind of hand drawn in a sense that made it incredibly accessible, but also explaining really complex stuff, just made me realize there are ways that we can communicate things in really simple ways, but we just kind of sometimes have to think outside of what we're used to in terms of the written word. Maybe the best way to do it is, data visualizations. Maybe we need some kind of, there's lots of different ways we can kind of tackle this issue. And I think sometimes we get stuck in doing things the way that we're used to, when really we should be kind of thinking, how do I make this accessible and understandable in a world where like everyone's on TikTok and everyone's got like 10 seconds, or on Instagram, and we need to like make it that people can understand it in 5 seconds. Maybe that's a terrible thing that we don't have that much time and attention anymore, but it's where we're at right now. And I feel like we need to be able to like respond to that and to think about different mediums that just work better for certain things. Hope that answers the question, guys.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think it's also about reminding yourself to keep doing that, isn't it? I mean, whilst you were both talking, I was thinking about how many times I've used the word net zero in event titles or briefs, and maybe I should rethink the kind of stuff that I'm putting out. Sticking with that theme of responsibility, I wanted to take Rory's question, which was, what can the public do to help the media improve coverage of climate change, the climate crisis, and climate collapse?
Emily, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go?
You go first on this one, I think.
That's a really, like, it's a fantastic kind of perspective, and it's great that Rory's even asking this question. I think one of the things that people can do is just make it really clear that they engage in this content and they find it important. I've had so many conversations with editors where they're just like, people don't care. Like, we've already covered this story. It's like, it's so hard. And it's so hard to just explain to editors that people are interested. We just have to find different ways to tell these stories, to bring in lots of different issues. So I think one thing that people can do is just engage with the content that has been created, to kind of give feedback to journalists that this works, this doesn't work. I think that's incredibly helpful. I think just generally finding ways to engage with that content and to show that it's important and relevant is so important to us as journalists, when we're like arguing with people, to say that people do care about this topic, people do care about this issue, and they do want to engage with it. I think be really vocal, just be like, I love this and we need to see more of this. And just to be able to support these kinds of media. I think we're living in an age where it's becoming increasingly difficult to kind of create the kind of work we want to do. If you can find ways to support like journalists and filmmakers and support the work that they do outside of established organizations as well, I think do it. I think it's really important, because I think as an activist I'm always like, there's always like radical stuff that's happening outside of the kind of mainstream media. And the mainstream media is obviously really important because it reaches so many people. But like, do support like your local media, like support with find out if you have like a local newsletter on climate change and engage with it, find ways to support them, whether it's like funding, paying a little bit of money, helping to distribute it, or just telling people about it. I think it's important to like tap into like your local press as well. They can be really powerful and they can really inform you about what's happening in your own backyard and who your MP is and what you can do to kind of improve the policy. So yeah, I think be vocal and support your local media, and like be prepared to pay for stuff sometimes, because I feel like people have forgotten that world. So yeah, I hope that answers. Emily?
I would just completely second all of that. In particular, the local media element, because local newspapers, particularly at the moment, are really struggling. And if you lose your local media, you lose a really important leg of democracy, because people become less engaged with their local area. And the environment starts outside your front door. It starts with your city's plans to, deal with air pollution. It starts with your local authority and how it deals with how often it mows the grass. And I think it's really important that you engage with your local democracy, and you do that. A really important way of doing that is through local media. And yeah, I just retweet all my stories. That would be but no, on a serious note, I totally agree. Engage and make it clear you're engaging and you want that content, because it's a consumer industry, and what gets consumed will get produced more. So.
Yeah, so that's great. The next question I wanted to go to was on a point that you made, Arwa, about inclusivity. And Logan's asked, if you are a pale, stale and male character, and you're invited to a panel or interview which predominantly also shares those characteristics, how do you feel that people can use those positions of privilege to make the discussion more diverse and inclusive? And also, I suppose, what should they do if they're asked to participate in one of those situations?
I think there's like two things that they can do, and one of them is just have a chat with the organizers and be like, hey guys, do you realize there's like 5 white guys on this panel and that's actually not a good thing? And we get it, I get it. I think it's a lot easier to arrange and to reach out to these people who generally do panels, and then they just kind of called again and again and again to kind of do the same talks. But I think if you're one of those people and you're like genuine about wanting change and bringing more diverse people into this conversation, because that's what we need to actually make this work, I think you should find ways to reach out to other people and say to the organizers like, hey, you know, I think your panel needs more diversity and I actually think you should invite X, Y, and Z. I've seen them at other talks, they're amazing, they would do a fantastic job. I think it might be difficult for you to like think about doing that, but I think it's the responsible thing to do, and that might sound a bit extreme, but I think it is. I think it's showing how serious you are about the need for more diverse voices. Invite someone else. I mean, I'll say to them, why don't you invite X, Y, and Z? Make recommendations. Like I said, Climate Reframe has listed 100 people working on climate change issues within the UK. They are out there, they do exist. They might just need a little bit of coaxing like I did. Like, I don't do these things very often and I'm kind of like, oh, but it's actually nice to get asked and just be like, no, do it. And the more I do it, the more kind of confidence I'll get, I'm sure, in future. So maybe also for panelists, people who are putting together these panels, just to kind of maybe take a chance on people sometimes, because there's lots of people who are really knowledgeable about what they do, but they just haven't had the experience to do as much public speaking. And so sometimes, like Georgina did, you just have to take a chance on someone and just be like, you know, I'm going to invite them, I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but I need to take that risk because I can't afford to have another pale male and stale panel. So yeah, to sum up, I think invite other people, make recommendations and suggestions, and just tell the people organizing that, hey, this is an issue and you need to take a chance on people who are maybe less experienced, but could actually also just contribute something really valuable to the conversation, and just illustrate that you're serious about being inclusive. Because if we're just talking to the same people, no matter how professional and amazing they are, we're failing ultimately. Sorry, end of lecture.
No, that's great. And I think sticking with that kind of theme of inclusivity and maximising the number of voices that we're hearing in the media, we have a question from Izzy, and it's, do you think that there should be more encouragement to get people from different sectors into journalism? So not just people who study journalism, and how do you think that could happen?
Yeah, shall I take that?
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, I think it's really, really important that we have more like diverse voices and people who just come from different perspectives and come from different backgrounds and just see the world slightly differently to the way that we do. I think it is really important. I think it will be a challenge to bring these people in, but I think there's so many people out there who are really passionate about these kinds of issues that never really get given a chance or a platform to kind of move forward. Like, I know so many like people who are like teachers or people who are like physiotherapists are also like really passionate about climate change, and they kind of get dismissed because there's this real notion that you have to be super professional and you have to have like a PhD and you have to have been doing this for like decades. And so I think we need to like change what's important. We need to think about expertise. Of course, it's really important, but there's also a really big conversation to be had in terms of the impact that climate change has. And those people aren't experts. You can't be an expert in how it impacts you. We're all experts in our own stories. And so I think there's really a place for like including way more kind of people in this conversation in terms of how they want their communities to be protected, how they want things to kind of take place, and also the impact that this is already having on them, or say their like diaspora communities back home. So yeah, I think it is really important. And I think a big part of it is people in the media just seeing value in different people's stories and narratives, and not constantly like falling back on the same expert, that's the science expert that's going to talk about the science. We need kind of other kinds of experiences and stories to tell. And for them, you need to move beyond like scientists. They're obviously really important, and there's some amazing kind of climate scientists out there. I'm just saying there has to be a space for others. And I think, yeah, journalists can play a role in terms of who they include in their kind of articles, who do they quote, who do they include in their films and documentaries. So I think we do have responsibility to be more inclusive. So yeah, I think that's one way we could do it, is just thinking about the work that we do and including as many voices. Hope that answers the question.
Emily, did you want to come in on routes into journalism, not from a journalism background?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I have a really, myself, a very conventional and, you know, pale, stale, and not male, obviously, but I tick all the other boxes. You know, I did English at university, and then I went to journalism college, and then I became a journalist. But yeah, I think there's always in any sector a real danger of groupthink. If everybody thinks the same, then everybody is going to assume that the same stories are important. And as Arwa was saying, you know, if you're not starting with a diversity of people writing the stories, you're not going to have a diversity of the voices they ask to speak, and you're not going to have a diversity of the stories themselves. And I think going back to sort of an earlier question, some of the most interesting ways of telling stories that I've seen in the mainstream media in recent years are those stories where you take an issue and you look at its impact. So, you know, let's not talk about the structural changes to the energy grid. Let's actually go onto a housing estate where council tenants have had solar panels put on their homes and the energy efficiency improvements done, and it's transformed their life and put 50 quid, you know, a month extra in their pockets because they're not having to pay for massive energy bills. But if you as a journalist have never set foot on a council estate, you're not going to even think of telling that story. And so, yeah, I mean, there are some schemes in terms of kind of attracting people into journalism from maybe non-traditional backgrounds, you know, so apprenticeships. So rather than the university route, which is a relatively recent thing, actually, journalists used to be, you know, come up through journalism from school. So there are those sort of elements, but yeah, I think there's definitely a call to do more of that. And I don't know what the answer is. Probably, you know, engage, tell your media that you want to hear other voices, and that you want, you know, to see other voices speaking. But yeah, no, I think there's definitely a need for it.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question now from Ella, who says, climate protests are often negatively framed in the media, so focusing on their disruption to the public's everyday life rather than focusing on the issues they're trying to raise. How do you think that we can overcome that? And I think this kind of links on to a question we had submitted in advance, which was, can you offer any advice on how, or whether we should respond to negative comments on articles or on social media, or maybe views that we don't agree with, and how we should interact with the people that are posting those things?
Okay, well, shall I start, because, you know, I think that's a kind of mainstream media issue. I think one of the really interesting things about the climate strikers, the school strikers, and Extinction Rebellion is that, well, I can talk maybe just a little bit about the school strikers. The tone of the way that the politicians responded to the school strikers went in the space of a month from, oh, do shut up and go back to school, to, oh, do you want to come into Parliament and meet with with national leaders? And I think a lot of that was to do with, you know, that there were the sort of, you know, the usual suspects saying, you know, this is a disgrace, they should go back to school, or you know, with XR, oh, they're blocking the streets. But I think what was really interesting about particularly the school strikers is they are very impressive group of young people. They speak so eloquently, they know their issues, they're not sort of histrionic or, you know, that kind of, oh, we're all doomed sort of. It's like they have very rational arguments. And I think sort of tying into that second question you were asking about engaging, I think, I mean, I don't go below the line because, you know, it's a nasty old world down there. But I think the important thing from my point of view, I always engage with people in good faith on the basis that, you know, and obviously I am skeptical about like sort of dodgy kind of commentary and news releases that I can see are obviously, you know, going to try to steer you off into a questionable place. But I think, you know, you act in good faith, and if it becomes clear that the other person you are engaging with is not acting in good faith, then I think you just have to, for your own self-preservation, just walk away, don't engage. But if people are acting in good faith, then do that. And I think that's also what you need to do if you are protesting. Yes, there will be negative coverage, but if you can stand there and say, you know, to an angry taxi driver, well, I'm sorry I'm blocking your street, but here are the reasons, then that's the best you can do. And you know, there will be space for that version of the story, as well as the more negative version of the story out there in this very plural media that Arwa's been talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think everyone, I think even as like individuals, we all do that. We kind of engage with people if they're like genuine about wanting to have a conversation. But a lot of the time, you do get like people who are just really, really set in their views, and it's a complete waste of time to speak to them and to actually have a conversation, because they're not really going to engage with what you're saying. And I think in those situations, I always think I'd rather use my energy to like educate my auntie who maybe doesn't know about this, or like speak to my neighbor where I can kind of have a real conversation. And I think if we all did that, that would be really amazing. If we had conversations with people around us, and we probably all know a member of family who's kind of thinks like this is all dodgy and not real and not really happening. And if we kind of engage with them on a genuine level and did it all the time, and we're like, look, you know, I love and respect you, and come from the conversation from a different space, I think we could have a kind of bigger impact. So yeah, I think if you're really passionate and you want to like change people's minds, I think start at home, start with the people around you, start with your friends, start with your family. I think that's a really powerful space to kind of have conversations, rather than on Twitter, on the internet, at the end of a very long night. I think obviously you can change people's minds on those spaces, but I think you're more powerful in your kind of within your own personal network. So I would say maximize those and have more conversations with people like that, even if they start getting really annoyed with you. Like, I think it's worth doing it. So yeah, I think yeah, definitely like start at home and start with the people around you. I think you can have a much bigger impact that way. And it's really nice to see people who kind of change their minds or like bring a completely different perspective to your own kind of like I've had lots of like religious family, and it's been amazing to talk to them about climate change and for them to say, yeah, you know, Islamically this, and this totally connects with my faith, and there's all these kinds of different ways of seeing it. But it's kind of nice. It's nice to see that there's different ways to see and understand the crisis, but to ultimately recognize that yes, there is this problem, and yes, we need to find action and solutions. So it can be really nice to have those conversations that can really help you see things and help you kind of find different ways to engage with different people in different spaces. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. George, I think we are past 3, so I'm going to pass back to you if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was so interesting, but we have to wrap up, unfortunately. So thank you so much to Emily and Arwa for that, as well as all our brilliant questions that we got both on Eventbrite and during the webinar. Thanks again to ECF and Gower Street for helping us put on these events. So you can join us tomorrow again for part 3, where we'll be discussing how decision makers and the media can interact to communicate climate change effectively, with Leo Barazzi, who's an expert in public opinion, campaigns and climate change policy, and author of The Climate Majority. It'll be really interesting, so please do join us again. And please do take time to fill out the feedback form that's going to pop up at the end. I know they're boring, but it'll only take a couple of minutes. Thanks everyone again for attending, and thank you so much for our speakers.